over to Dr. Anthony Montero with the year in Du Bois.
Thank you very much, Professor Smith.
Welcome.
It's good to see you again.
Good to be here.
Listen, last week we kind of paid tribute to Aretha Franklin by reading from Du Bois's book, The Souls of Black Folk, which he published in 1903. Mm-hmm. And we read from the final chapter of that book called The Sorrow Songs. And we placed Aretha's music within the framework of these sorrow songs, what Du Bois said, the rhythmic narrative of a disappointed people. And today, we want to read what Du Bois said about the black church, because the sorrow songs are institutionalized and live in the black church. And there's a chapter of the Souls of Black Folk entitled Of the Faith of the Fathers. And I think this chapter will give us certain insights, not just on the black church, but on the music and culture and what Du Bois calls the interior ethical life of the transplanted African.
Which is the faith of the fathers.
Yeah, the faith of the fathers. So I hope I don't read too long, but...
No, you got a good amount of time. Okay. And for the callers, again, if you calling up about Du Bois, don't call me about rebuild right now.
Okay, here we go. That the Negro Church preceded the Negro family leads to an explanation of much that is paradoxical in this communistic institution and in the morals of its members. But especially it leads us to regard this institution as peculiarly the expression of the inner ethical life of a people, in a sense seldom true elsewhere. Let us turn then from the outer physical development of the church to the more important inner ethical life of the people who compose it. The Negro has already been pointed out many times as a religious creature, a being of that deep emotional nature which turns instinctively towards the supernatural, endowed with a rich tropical imagination and a keen, delicate appreciation of nature. The transplanted African lived in a world animate with gods and devils, elves and witches, full of strange influences, of good to be implored, of evil to be rejected. Slavery, then, was to him the dark triumph of evil over him. All the hateful powers of the underworld were striving against him, and in spite of revolt and revenge, revolt and revenge filled his heart. He called up all the resources of voodooism to aid exorcism and witchcraft, the mysterious Obi worship with its barbarous rites, spells, and blood sacrifice, even now and then of human victims. Weird midnight orgies and mystic conjurations were invoked. The witch woman and the voodoo priest became the center of Negro group life, and that vein of vague superstition which characterizes the unlettered Negro even today was deepened and strengthened. In spite, however, of such success as that of the fierce Maroons, the Danish blacks, and others, the spirit of revolt gradually died away under the untiring energy and superior strength of the slave masters. By the middle of the 18th century, the black slave had sunk with hushed murmurs to his place at the bottom of this new economic system and was unconsciously ripe for a new philosophy of life. Nothing suited his condition then better than the doctrine of passive submission embodied in the newly learned Christianity. Slave masters early realized this and cheerfully aided religious propaganda within certain bounds. The long system of repression and degradation of the Negro tended to emphasize the elements in his character which made him a valuable piece of property. Courtesy became humility, moral strength degenerated into submission, and the exquisite native appreciation of the beautiful became an infinite capacity for dumb suffering. The Negro, losing the joy of this world, eagerly seized upon the offered conceptions of the next, the avenging spirit of the Lord enjoining patience in this world under sorrow and tribulation until that great day when he, God, would lead his dark children home. And this became his comforting dream. This deep religious fatalism, painted so beautifully in Uncle Tom, came soon to breed, as all fatalistic faiths will, the sensualist side by side with the martyr. Under the lax moral life of the plantation, where marriage was a farce, laziness a virtue, and property a theft, a religion of resignation and submission degenerated easily in less strenuous minds. And then Du Bois continues. With the beginning of the abolitionist movement against slavery and the gradual growth of a class of free Negroes came a change. We often neglect the influence of the free Africans before the war because of the smallness of his numbers and the small weight he had in the history of the nation. But we must not forget that his chief influence was internal, was exerted on the black world, and that there he was the ethical and social leader. Huddled as he was in a few centers like Philadelphia, New York, and New Orleans, the masses of the freedmen sank into poverty and listlessness, but not all of them. The free Negro leader early arose, and his chief characteristic was intense earnestness and deep feeling on the slavery question. Freedom became to him a real thing and not a dream. His religion became darker and more intense, and into his ethics crept a note of revenge. Into his songs, a day of reckoning close at hand. The coming of the Lord swept this side of death and came to be a thing to be hoped for this day. Through fugitive slaves and irrepressible discussion, this desire for freedom seized the black millions still in bondage. And because their one ideal of life, and became their one ideal of life, the black poet caught new notes and sometimes even dared to sing, "Oh freedom, oh freedom, oh freedom over me. Before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave and go home to my Lord and be free." For 50 years, Negro religion thus transformed itself and identified itself with the dream of freedom until that which was a radical fad in the white North and an anarchistic plot in the white South had become a religion to the black world. Thus, when emancipation finally came, it seemed to the freed Africans a literal coming of the Lord. His fervid imagination was stirred as never before by the tramp of armies, the blood and dust of battle, and the wail and whirl of social upheaval. He stood dumb and motionless before the whirlwind. What had he to do with it? Was it not the Lord's doing and marvelous in his eyes? Joyed and bewildered with what came, he stood awaiting new wonders till the inevitable age of reaction swept over the nation and brought the crisis of today. It is difficult to explain clearly the present critical stage of Negro religion. First, we must remember that living as the blacks do in close contact with a great white modern nation and sharing, although imperfectly, the sole life of that nation, they must necessarily be affected more or less directly by all the religious and ethical forces that are today moving the United States. These questions and movements are, however, overshadowed and dwarfed by the, to them, all-important question of their civil, political, and economic rights. They must perpetually discuss the Negro problem, must live, move, and have their being in it, and interpret all in its light or darkness. With this came too peculiar problems of their inner life, of the status of women, the maintenance of the home, the training of children, the accumulation of wealth, and the prevention of crime. All this must mean a time of intense ethical ferment, of religious heart-searching and intellectual unrest. from the double life every American Negro must live as a Negro and as an American, as swept on the current of the 19th while yet struggling in the eddies of the 15th century. From this must arise a painful self-consciousness, an almost morbid sense of personality, and a moral hesitancy which is fatal to self-confidence. The worlds within and without the veil of color are changing, and changing rapidly, but not at the same rate, not in the same way. And this must produce a peculiar wrenching of the soul, a peculiar sense of doubt and bewilderment. Such a double life with double thoughts, double duties, and double social classes must give rise to double worlds and double ideals, and tempt the mind to pretense or to revolt, to hypocrisy or to radicalism. I'll stop there.
Make sure when you call, you talking about Du Bois.
Yes.
But we'll take a quick break. Now is your time to get on the line. We'll take the calls in order. Please try to limit to 1 or 2 questions. 215-634-8065. Again, 215-634-8065. Dr. Anthony Montero here at Du Bois. Aaron Smith, rapping professor. Queen Kuwait, the super producer, put some respect on her name. JB, the young phenom on the board. And of course, you for waking up with word, y'all.
At Moss Rehab, we know the power rebuilding bodies and minds has toward rebuilding lives, which is why we're dedicated to being pioneers of innovative therapies, robotics, and research. For 25 years, Moss Rehab has been ranked as one of the top rehabilitation hospitals in the nation by U.S. News and World Report. Proof that that power is right here in our doctors, therapists, patients, and instilled in our legacy. Moss Rehab. Challenge accepted.
This is Tony Staten, Executive Director of LESIT. On behalf of the working families of the Laborers District Council of Philadelphia and vicinity, I want to encourage you to vote in the upcoming midterm elections in November. This is perhaps one of the most important elections of our times. In order to vote, you must be registered. Please, October the 9th is the last day to register for the November elections. Voting can be the great equalizer, but only when your vote is cast. Don't forget to tune into Labor's Live every Friday at 4 p.m. This message is brought to you by LESIT, Labor's Employers Cooperation and Education Trust.
Man, do I love card night. You ready, boys? You got a king?
Go, fish dad.
Oh, come on. This is WWE superstar Titus O'Neil. It only takes a moment to make a moment. Take time to be a dad today. Learn more at 877-4DAD-411 or visit fatherhood.gov.
Brought to you by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Ad Council.
You're listening to Wake Up with Word on Word Radio, 96.1 FM and 900 AM WURD, Independent Black Media.
Independent Black Media, 900 AM, 96.1 FM, WURD, WURDradio.com. Listen live anytime and log on. If you don't have that app, you know where to go download an app like you know. In studio, Dr. Anthony Montero here at Du Bois, going straight to the phone lines. Brother Tyrone, thank you for waking up with Word.
Well, good morning, both good docs and my wonderful sis and the good brother Jay. I just want to just try to say, Doc, what in the world is our problem that with all of these things that we have lived through and all the greatness and the great minds that we have, that we can do better than what we're doing?
Well, let me just say this, Tyrone. That's a very interesting question, and that's a question that confronts all of us and all of our thinking. A lot of what that question is driven by comes from the fact that much of what we have achieved and have produced in our history here is not known to us. And I think... Yes, and I think what Du Bois has done in this book, The Souls of Black Folk, is to attempt to answer that very question. Our problem is a problem that comes from our enslavement. It is external to us as a people, but because we are not separated from the history of this country, it infects or affects our internal life. And that's what this part that I read is all about.
Okay. Mm-hmm. And Doc, are you going to be at the at the
yes, I'm going to try to be there. I know at the Bloxon collection. I'm going to try to be there today. Yes.
Oh, okay, because it looks interesting.
Yes.
All right, good brother. Always, man.
Thank you.
Keep sharing the love, man, and keep sharing the knowledge. We are such good people and just in a bad place, I guess.
Well,
Take care,
yes.
brother.
If you don't mind, can you share the Bloxon information for people that want to come down today?
I think the day at 2 o'clock at the Bloxon Collection in Sullivan Hall, they're going to show Louis Messiah's film, W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography in 4 voices, and I think Louis Messiah will be there as well.
So make sure you all come down and support. The Bloxon is a special place. Temple University, 2 o'clock. On the lines right now, Reverend Joe from Mount Airy. You are waking up with word.
Well, good morning, Dr. Montero. How are you? And all you guys stole my thunder. I'm on my way to Temple to do the opening prayer at 2 o'clock at the Bloxon Collection.
Great.
Dr. Montero, so I'm glad he knows about it. And Dr. Smith, you need to call me. Our church started because a man was getting out of the penitentiary in Gradesford Prison after spending 53 years in the penitentiary, and that's how this fellowship started 47 years ago. I need to talk to you about that.
No, will do.
Hey, thank you. God bless.
Oh, I thought you had Du Bois question. Brother JB, who's next on the line? And you can also call in 215-634-8065, 215-634-8065. And on the line right now, we have Sandra from Oak Lane.
Good morning.
Hello, Sandra.
Good morning, Dr. Montero. I have 2 questions. How did the transition from the Negro church to the black church take place? And what were the class and social forces that helped shape it? And how would you infuse the Communist Party into that change?
Well, to the last part, I don't know that I would infuse the Communist Party, but what Du Bois shows is that what he calls the black church, and I put quotes around that, in the beginning was not Christian. It was a synthesis and a combination of many of the ethical and spiritual systems that the transplanted Africans brought with them to the United States. And even in spite of slavery, they formed these spiritual and what we call religious institutions. Now, the strong point that Du Bois makes, I think I read part of this, is that before there was a black family, because the family was outlawed, before there was a black family, there were black spiritual and religious institutions. And so the history of the black church, as it were, predates the black family. Now, Du Bois says, therefore, this gives a communistic or cooperative character to black people's lives. Now, because of the severity of repression, the religious life of black people, the spiritual life, became submissive. And the slave owners, of course, saw this as an opportunity to impose a certain type of Christianity. But then, he says, the freedmen, the so-called freed Negroes in the North, began to form religious institutions such as Mother Bethel AME Church, Mother Zoar Methodist Church, and St. Thomas's African Episcopal Church. And these became the vanguard of the struggle for freedom. And these churches were based upon principles of rebellion, of the struggle for freedom, and the ethical life of the church was defined by the idea that we choose death over slavery. And thus, the Northern Negro, such people as Henry Highland Garnett, who was famous for saying, let your motto be, resist, 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 or others who stood up and guided the thinking of black folk, North and South, free and unfree, towards the goal of abolition. So that's the way I would put it.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Oh, and thank you, Sister Sandra. Jacob, I'm sorry. You're waking up with word.
Peace be unto you two doctors there. I wanted to ask Dr. Montero, was
Mr. Du Bois, was he an atheist or agnostic?
That's a very interesting question. Let me just begin answering that question by saying he wrote a book of prayers, which he called Prayers for Black People. Now, the reason he wrote that is that when he first started his teaching career at Wilberforce and then at Atlanta University, and at black colleges then, maybe some today, every day you would start the day in chapel. You would go to the chapel, and there would be prayers and other announcements would be made. And Du Bois was often asked to pray. And at the time, he was not highly religious, although he had been raised to be religious. And he was asked to pray, and he didn't want to pray. And so ultimately, when he went to Atlanta University, he wrote a book of prayers for black people, which were in the tradition of Christianity or black Christianity as a form of resistance. Now, to the question of whether he was an atheist, I don't think he was an atheist. He was a theist, by which I mean he believed that there was a God who created the universe, but that all of the great moral and social issues of man and of black humanity were in the hands of people, not of God. I do think, however, his predisposition was towards theism and maybe agnosticism. He didn't say God didn't exist. On the other side, he didn't say God existed.
Thank you, Jacob, for waking up with Word. We also have Fatira or Fatima? Fatira from West Philly? Good morning, yes, Fatira. Thank you for waking up with Word.
Good morning, good morning. And Dr. Montero, this is your buddy Fatira, and it's just always a pleasure to hear you read from Du Bois and hear your expound on it. I enjoy it very much.
Yes, thank you. It's good hearing from you.
It's good. It's very good to hear you too. I always listen I always listen to the station anyway. But it just makes me think as you're reading it and talking about it, how much has gone into keeping us subjugated and down and separated. I mean, it's like these people's life work has been to make these devious plans, whether it's religion or, of course, commercial, whatever it is, just to keep us separated and keep us down, which makes me to think that we must be a mighty people who have survived all this.
As to that point, if I might comment, Du Bois believed that if you know the truth can help to make you free. And as a social scientist, and by the way, this essay that I read from, I consider to be a foundation of cultural anthropology, and one of the first examples of how to actually do cultural anthropology. But he believed that the role of the black intellectual, be she or he, formally educated or not, was to be in the leadership of the people, educating them, bringing the truth to them. And one of the things that he discovers throughout the history of his body of work is the fact that you just made, that we are a powerful people up against a very, very powerful enemy and opposition. The question for him is, how do we achieve freedom? And he never gave up on the idea of freedom. How do we achieve freedom under these circumstances? And just my last point, one of the solutions to that problem for him was to go global with our struggle, and thus the Pan-African movement, his idea of the unity of Pan-Africa and Pan-Asia, the Afro-Asiatic movement, and so on. And many followed in his wake. And my last point, if you don't mind, Fatira, is, I discuss a lot of times with Minister Rodney of Mosque Number 12. We discuss Du Bois and we discuss the Honorable Elijah Muhammad and Noble Drew Ali. Both Noble Drew Ali and the Honorable Elijah Muhammad re-identified African Americans as they put it, Asiatic black men and women. And this concept of the linkage of blackness or Africa and Asia to compose this people is an interesting, and I would argue, powerful ethical, psychological forming of our identity.
Thank you, Fatira.
Thank you, Fatira.
For waking up with Word. And we thank Dr. Anthony Montero in the year of Du Bois.